1855, Missouri, United States. In the silence of the night, a young enslaved named Celia lived under an invisible terror. Since she was 14, she was forced to lie down with her lord, a man who saw her not as a person but as a property. For years, his life has been marked by abuse and violence. There was no law to protect her. There was no justice for a slave black woman. But with each aggression, a force of resistance was born within it. Until one night, when he tried to force her once more, Celia revolted. Armed only with his courage and survival instinct, he faced the man who enslaved and killed him. What could be seen as self-defense was treated as an unforgivable crime. His trial has become a public spectacle. Even with testimonies confirmed the abuse, Celia was sentenced to death. His history crossed time as a symbol of the cruelty of the slave system and the courage of a woman who refused to remain silent. Stories like Celia's remind us that slavery was not only currents and forced labor, it was also abuse, silencing, and pain without justice. If you believe Celia's memory should be remembered, subscribe to the channel and answer in the comments. For you, was Celia a criminal or a warrior who fought for her own dignity? Missouri, 1855. The air was vibrated with suffocating heat, and the sun burned the skin with relentless fury. In the fields, the sound of the whips cutting the air was like thunder, followed by the muffled screams of the slaves who worked to exhaustion. The smell of sweat and blood impregnated the air, a bitter metallic mixture that clung to the nostrils and persisted in memory. The ground, irregular and full of stones, was stained by the history of suffering and injustice that unfolded daily under the complacent eyes of society of that time. George Newsom Plantation extended to where the view was. He was a man in his early 60s, with a haughty posture and cold look, who never hesitated to impose his authority with brutality. Newsom was known for his merciless treatment to slaves, and his laugh was more feared than the whip sound. His blue eyes, as cold as steel, did not blink at the suffering of others. He delighted in his absolute power over those who considered his property. Celia, a young slave of just 19 years old, was one of the numerous souls trapped by Newsom. With a look that carried the pain of a life of abuse, she worked tirelessly in the fields, her calloused hands telling stories of suffering and resistance. Celia had been bought by Newsom when she was only 14, and since then, her life had become an endless nightmare. The abuse began almost immediately, and his body was a battlefield of scars and bruises, silent witnesses of the violence she supported. Missouri society at that time was a rigid structure, where the law not only allowed, but encouraged the dehumanization of blacks. The judges and sheriffs were all chosen by the rich landowners, and any attempt at justice for slaves was quickly crushed. The law was always with slaveholders, and any resistance was punished with unimaginable cruelty. The social hierarchy was like a castle of letters, where the most vulnerable were in the background, supporting the weight of a nation built on their backs. The nights were the only times when Celia could try to find some relief from the brutality of the day. However, the darkness brought his own terrors, for it was when Newsom called her to his cabin, where the muffled shouts were heard only by the night winds. Celia, however, was not just a passive victim. Inside it, a flame of resistance burned, fueled by the desire for freedom and the dream of one day seeing their oppressors pay for their cruelties. Gradually, Celia began to plan her revenge. He watched Newsom carefully, memorizing his habits, the moments when he was most vulnerable. With each passing day, his determination grew, strengthened by the memories of his lost friends for the brutality of the masters. She knew that her only chance to escape that hell was through a desperate act of courage. One night, while the moon illuminated Celia's path to Newsom Cabana, she made her decision. With trembling hands, she grabbed a stick, her heart beating hard with adrenaline and fear. She knew the consequences would be terrible, but the freedom, even momentary, was a price she was willing to pay. That night, Celia was no longer just a slave. She had become a warrior, ready to fight for her dignity and her life. Celia's fate was sealed that night, a night that would be marked in history as a symbol of resistance and courage. The land of Missouri, a silent witness to so many injustices, would finally be bathed with the blood of an oppressor, becoming a battlefield where a struggle for freedom and justice was waged. Thus, in the suffocating heat of a summer night, Celia raised her makeshift weapon and, with a decisive blow, marked the beginning of her journey to liberation. The sound of impact reverberated in the night, an explosion of justice that would echo through the ages, challenging unfair laws and inspiring future generations to fight oppression. Missouri's oppressive heat did not give a respite when Celia, at the age of 14, was dragged to the plantation of George Newsom. The trip to the property had been a nightmare of uncertainty, amid strangers who treated it as a commodity. His still innocent eyes last watched the world through the bars of a wagon, surrounded by shouts and the acre smell of sweaty bodies. Upon arrival, he was received not with welcome words, but with the cold gaze of Newsom, a man whose presence emanated cruelty and absolute power. Celia was too young to completely understand what was going on, but the pain of her family's separation still echoed in her mind. Your parents, brothers, all left behind, their voices and faces now only distant memories. Life in plantation has proved quickly as an endless cycle of work and abuse. The mornings began before sunrise, with the touch of the bell that called the slaves to the fields. The work was hard, and Celia's hands, once delicate, became rough and calloused, marked by the incessant effort and the tools she used. But it was at night that Celia faced her true torment. Newsom, in her cabin, waited for her. The way there was a nightmare corridor, where each step was heavy with anticipation and fear. The small, suffocating cabin became the scenario of its worst anguish. Newsom did not see Celia as a person, but as a possession, something to be used and discarded as you will. The cabin walls were seedlings of silenced shouts and tears Celia spilled night after night. Celia quickly learned to hide her emotions, to become a shadow of herself to survive. Each night was a battle against the growing sense of despair, but inside it, a spark of resistance began to shine. She knew she wasn't completely alone. Other women in the plantation shared their suffering, and at stealthy times they exchanged words of support and solidarity, a sisterhood forged by pain and the need for survival. Time has passed, and Celia became skillful to hide her hatred and determination under a facade of obedience. She watched Newsom carefully, recording her routines and weaknesses. During the day, while working in the fields, his mind was busy with escape and revenge plans. Every whispered insult, every unwanted touch, fed its resolution of one day ending that cycle of abuse. Celia began to find small forms of resistance. In the fields, she helped other slaves whenever she could, sharing the little she had, whether food or words of encouragement. She became a figure of hope for those around her, although her own heart was constantly on the verge of despair. At night, after the forced meetings with Newsom, she allowed herself to dream freely, imagining a world where she could walk freely, where her dignity was not torn from her daily. Time was not kind, but forged in Celia a sharp weapon of determination and courage. Each scar on his body was a reminder of his resilience. Every spilled tear was a promise that one day she would see her oppressors pay for her cruelty. The desire for revenge grew inside her, a fire that could not be extinguished. Thus, Celia turned her pain into strength, her submission into strategy. She knew that the path to freedom would be paved with risks and sacrifices, but was willing to pay the price. The world around him was dark and full of injustice, but it would not allow it to define his destiny. Celia was more than a slave. He was a warrior in formation, ready to fight for justice and dignity denied him. In the darkness of her darker nights, she found the courage to not only survive, but to finally break free. Missouri's heat seemed to intensify the weight of time, which passed slowly, dragging on as a spectrum of suffering. For Celia, the years in the plantation of George Newsom accumulated as layers of pain stacked on her body and soul. Each day was a relentless repetition of strenuous work under the scorching sun, followed by nights of horror in the newsroom. It was as if the time itself conspired to imprison it in an endless cycle of abuse and despair. The absence of legal or social protection turned Celia into a prisoner without visible grids, but with chains as real as those that held their feet to the floor of the plantation. Missouri society, with its cruel laws and insensitive judges, deliberately ignored the suffering of slaves, who were seen as less than humans. Any attempt to seek justice was crushed quickly, and the hope of a better life seemed a distant dream, impossible to achieve. For Celia, the only way to support the years of abuse was to find strength in fragmented memories of happier times when she was still with her family. She kept alive the memory of her mother's face, her brother's laughter, and clung to these memories like an anchor amid the storm of suffering surrounding her. Sometimes, in times of stealthy silence, Celia whispered songs that her mother used to sing, allowing a brief relief in the midst of chaos. With each night that passed in the Newsom cabin, Celia's heart hardened a little more. The abuses she endured were brutal and merciless, marking her skin and soul with scars that would never completely disappear. But instead of succumbing to despair, Celia turned her pain into fuel for her growing determination. She promised herself that one day would get rid of the clutches of Newsom and would make him pay for every vile act he had committed against her. Solitude was a constant companion, but Celia was not totally helpless. There were others in the plantation that shared their suffering, and together they formed a silent network of mutual support. Women in particular found comfort in each other, sharing stories and hopes in shy whispers. They became sisters of soul, united by pain and determination to resist. The years of abuse made Celia a cunning observer, and she began to realize the weaknesses of Newsom. Although he introduced himself as an almighty gentleman, there were cracks on his facade. Her habit of drinking until late at night, her explosions of anger followed by moments of vulnerability, all this was not unnoticed by Celia. She kept every detail, turning knowledge into a potential weapon for the future. Despite all the pain and suffering, there were times when Celia allowed hope to penetrate her heart. She dreamed of the day when she could walk freely, without fear, and own her own destiny. These moments of hope were fleeting, but they served to strengthen their resolution of fighting for a better life. Celia refused to be defined only as a victim. Inside her, a warrior was awakening, ready to fight for justice and freedom. With each passing year, Celia's desire for revenge grew, fed each night at the Newsom cabin, each morning starting with a whip cutting the air. She knew that the road to freedom would be dangerous and uncertain, but was willing to take the risk. Celia was determined to transform her pain into power, her indignation into action, and her suffering into a scream of freedom that would echo beyond the walls of the plantation. Thus, while time continued his relentless course, Celia waited patiently for her opportunity to retaliate. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she was determined to forge a future where she could live without fear, a future where her dignity was not constantly denied. The path would be hard and full of challenges, but Celia was ready to face them, armed with the courage and determination that the years of abuse had forged in her heart. Missouri's warmth that night seemed almost suffocating, as if nature itself was about to explode in a storm of fury. The cicadas sang in unison, a bastard sound that echoed through the plantation, mingling with the rustle of the leaves that stirred under the night breeze. Celia was alone in her cabin, sitting in a dark corner, her heart beating wildly like a war drum. Fear and anger intertwined inside her, creating a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume her. But that night, something was different. The flame of resistance that burned on her chest had turned into a fire, and she knew she could no longer endure pain and humiliation. George Newsom, the lord of the plantation, was a man of predictable habits. He dragged on to his hut with heavy steps, the smell of alcohol emanating from his skin like a toxic cloud. His normally cold and calculating eyes were glazed by the drink, but still carried the same predatory intention as always. He had become complacent in his abuse routine, believing that Celia was completely under her control. But he underestimated the strength he lived in the young woman slave, the same strength she had silently cultivated for years, waiting for the right moment to break free. Celia heard Newsom's footsteps approaching, getting closer and closer, as a predator preparing to attack her prey. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the heart that hammered in her chest. Her hands closed on fists, and she forced herself to remember every moment of pain, every spilled tear, each night in the cabin that was now about to become the scene of her revolt. Fear consumed her, but the determination burned even more intensely. It was a night without return, a night when your life would take a different course, no matter the cost. When Newsom entered the cabin, his lull and confident smile made Celia's blood freezing. He approached the same contempt as always, as if it were just an object, a possession of its own will. But Celia was no longer the scared young woman he had bought years ago. She slowly stood up, a fixed look at Newsom, which stopped for a moment, surprised by the change in her attitude. There was something in her eyes, a fierce determination he didn't recognize. Without hesitation, Celia took a stick that had hidden behind her back. It was a simple piece of wood, but that night he would become the tool of his liberation. With a scream of pure fury, she advanced on Newsom, the stuck in the stick, ready to fight for her life. The first blow hit the side of his head with a dry crack, the sound reverberating in the small cabin like thunder. Newsom staggered, stunned, trying to understand what was going on. But Celia didn't stop. Each next blow was a release of years of pain and suffering, each impact a statement that she would no longer be a victim. Newsom fell to the ground, the blood gushing from the head into open wounds, his eyes wide in a deadly astonishment. He tried to defend himself, but Celia's strength, fueled by her anger and despair, was relentless. With each blow, she remembered the nights of terror, the scars in her body, the tears she had spilled. It was as if every fiber of his being is shouting for justice, for freedom. And that night she found her. When he finally stopped, panting and covered with sweat, Celia looked into Newsom's inert body. He was dead. The blood spreads down the dirt floor of the cabin. The silence that followed was deafening, interrupted only by Celia's heavy breathing. She fell to her knees, the stick still tight in her hand, while tears of relief and terror dripped down her face. What she had done could not be undone, and the price she would pay was unknown. But in her heart she knew that for the first time she had fought for herself. She had refused to be a victim. The night Celia killed George Newsom was not just an act of despair. It was a scream of freedom that would echo throughout the plantation. The news would spread rapidly, burning the imagination of the slaves who saw a heroine, a living proof that the power of the masters was not absolute. And while the world around him continued to spin, Celia, her knees on the cabin, felt the weight of what she had done, but also the lightness of a new hope that was born inside her. The road ahead would be arduous, but that night she had taken the first step toward her release. The dawn the next day was dyed by an opaque gray, as if heaven himself was mourning for what had happened in the plantation of George Newsom. The news of his death spread quickly, like an uncontrollable fire, and soon the property was taken by a frenzy of frightened murmurs and accusing glances. The slaves whispered with each other, with a mixture of fear and reverence for Celia, who had committed the unthinkable. For them, she was not just a young slave. It was a warrior who had dared to challenge the cruel yoke of Newsom. But the surrounding society did not see Celia with the same eyes. For whites, especially the powerful who benefited from the slavery system, she was a criminal, a threat that needed to be contained. The authorities quickly arrived at the plantation, their hard and determined faces, as if they already knew the story they wanted to tell. Celia was dragged from her cabin, her hands tied with rough strings that bit her skin, while the eyes of other slaves accompanied her with a mixture of fear and respect. The trip to the court was a nightmare of uncertainty. Celia, trapped in the cart that carried her, saw the world pass through the wooden bars, feeling like a trapped animal. George Newsom's reminder dead was still vivid in his mind, his wide eyes arrested at his last moment of surprise and fear. Celia didn't regret it. Despite the terror of what was coming, there was a strange calm inside her. She had done what, and he needed to be done. And even if the price was high, he knew he had fought for his dignity. The court was an imposing construction. Its wooden walls resonated with the history of injustices committed in the name of the law. Celia was taken inside, her hands still tied, while the eyes of the white spectators were fixing on her with a mixture of repulsion and morbid curiosity. She was placed before a severe face judge, who looked at her with disdain, as if she had already decided her destination even before the trial began. The witnesses were called, one after another, to report what had happened. They told the stories of abuse, the nights of horror in the Newsom cabin, the muffled screams they had heard. But despite its testimonies, the courtroom remained hostile to Celia. The justice she expected to find was absent, replaced by a trial that looked more like a theater where her destination was already sealed. Celia, standing before the court, remained firm, her challenging posture even in the face of imminent condemnation. She was not alone. In his heart, he carried the voices of all those who had suffered beside her, who had resisted in silence, waiting for a moment of redemption. But the judge, a man with severe face and hardened heart, was not moved. For him, Celia was guilty, no matter what she had endured. The defense lawyer, a young and inexperienced man, did his best to present Celia's case, arguing that she had acted in self-defense, which had been led to the limit for years of abuse. He talked about the lack of protection for slave women, about the brutality of the system that oppressed them. But his words were like grains of sand taken by the wind, powerless in the face of the tide of prejudice that permeated the courtroom. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted Celia as a cold killer, a woman who had planned and executed an act of violence without remorse. They deliberately ignored the years of abuse, the pain she had endured, focusing only on the final act, as if that was all that mattered. For them, the social order could not be challenged, and Celia represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The verdict, when he was finally uttered, fell on Celia as a death sentence. She was considered guilty, with no appeal, with no hope of mercy. The courtroom exploded in murmurs of approval or indignation, but to Celia, the sound was distant, drowned out by the roar of her own heart. She had been tried not for her actions, but for whom she was, for her color, for being a woman who had dared to fight for her freedom. As he was taken away, Celia kept her head up, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She knew her fate was sealed, but she also knew her resistance act would not be forgotten. In the hearts of slaves, their history would live as a symbol of courage and challenge, a flame of hope in a world of oppressive darkness. And although the future was uncertain, Celia was at peace, knowing that even in her defeat she had won a victory that would echo for generations. The Missouri sun seemed more cruel that day, spilling its relentless light over the court as if it wanted to highlight the injustice that unfolded there. The small room was full of curious faces, eager for witnessing Celia's fate, the young slave who had dared to challenge the established order. The murmurs were muffled, but they carried the weight of centuries of oppression and prejudice, resonating on the wooden walls as a persistent echo of a society that refused to change. Celia was there, in the center of everything, her fixed eyes on the worn wood floor, while the judge gave the sentence. He was a corpulent man, with a reddish face of anger. Every word of his was like a hammer of condemnation, beating hard on Celia's soul. "Guilty," he declared, his voice resonating with the tense silence of the court. Guilty of premeditated murder. For him, she was not a woman, a victim, but a rebel property that needed to be controlled and, if necessary, eliminated. Only Celia seemed alien to the commotion around her. She was static, like a sculpted statue in suffering and resistance. Her face is an impassive mask of determination. Inside her, a whirlwind of emotions struggled to escape, but she refused to give in. The decision had already been made before she even entered that room. She knew that. There was no room for justice or empathy, just for the maintenance of a system that saw it as nothing more than a disposable piece in its cruel gear. The defense lawyer, a sad-eyed young man, made a last, almost desperate appeal, trying to convince the court that it was not just Celia's life at stake, but the humanity's own system. "She is not just a slave," he declared, his voice embargoed by emotion. "She is a woman who suffered unimaginable abuse, who acted in self-defense. We cannot ignore it. We cannot treat it as mere property." But his words fell into deaf ears, crushed by the indifference of a court that had already decided that the status quo could not be challenged. The prosecution, on the other hand, delighted in his victory. The prosecutor, a severe man and calculating look, painted Celia as a cold killer, deliberately ignoring the context of her acts. "She killed a man in her sleep," he said, with a coldness that made the blood freezing. "It does not deserve our pity, but the punishment that the law requires." For him, the question was simple. A slave had killed a white man, and that was unforgivable. The sentence was issued quickly, as if the court wanted to get rid of that burden as soon as possible. Celia would be hanged, a public execution to serve as an example for anyone who dared to follow her way. The news spread as fire through the community, causing a mix of shock and resignation among slaves, who saw in their sentence a confirmation of the cruelty of the world in which they lived. While being taken out of court, Celia kept her head up, refusing to show any sign of weakness. His eyes, once so full of fear and despair, were now inflamed with a fierce determination. She knew her fate was sealed, but she also knew her story wouldn't end there. In the hearts of slaves, it would become a legend, living proof that resistance was possible, even in the face of the most brutal oppression. The following days were a mist of uncertainty, while Celia awaited her destination in a cold, damp cell isolated from the outside world. But even there, she wasn't alone. The voices of other slaves, their stories and hopes, echoed in his mind, offering him comfort and strength. She knew she couldn't change what was coming, but she could face death with dignity, knowing that her fight had not been in vain. On the morning of its execution, the sky was heavy with dark clouds, as if nature itself was mourning for what was about to happen. The crowd gathered, attracted by the promise of a morbid spectacle, its faces a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. But above all, there was a solemn silence, a feeling that something bigger was at stake. Celia was taken to the place of her execution, her firm steps, her haughty posture, as if she were the queen of an invisible kingdom. As she looked at the gallows, she felt a strange calm seize her. This was his final moment, but it was also the beginning of something bigger. She knew that her death would not be forgotten, that her story would resonate over time, inspiring others to fight for justice and freedom. While the rope was placed around his neck, Celia closed her eyes, allowing himself a last moment of peace. She thought of her family, her friends, the faces of those who had suffered by her side. And then, with one last breath, she whispered a silent prayer, not for herself, but for all those who would come after her. When the platform was removed, Celia's body swayed softly in the air, a lonely figure against the gray sky. But at that moment, she was not just a victim. It was a symbol of resistance, a flame of hope that could not be erased. And while the world continued its relentless course, Celia's story would become a legend, a testimony of courage and challenge in the face of oppression. In the hearts of those who knew her, and even in those who only heard her story, Celia would live forever, a heroine in an endless struggle for justice and dignity. And although his body was dead, his spirit would continue to inspire generations of oppressed to rise and fight for what was right to them. Celia's death was not just the end of a life. It was the beginning of a new era of resistance and hope. Missouri's oppressive heat seemed to intensify the sense of injustice that hanged in the air, involving the plantation and the surroundings as a suffocating cloak. Celia's death, though tragic and unfair, had caused a silent agitation among slaves, who saw a spark of resistance in a world where hope was a rare luxury. However, for slaves and the authorities, their execution had served as a brutal reminder that the status quo should be kept at any cost. In the plantation, silence was palpable, as if the land itself was mourning for what had happened. The slaves worked in silence, their faces marked by tiredness and pain, but inside them, a flame of indignation burned intensely. Celia's death would not be forgotten, and although her voices were silenced by oppression, his memories kept alive the promise that one day they would be free. The authorities, however, saw Celia's death a need to reaffirm control and order. For them, justice was not a matter of equity or morality, but a tool for maintaining power and domination. The decision to condemn Celia to death had been taken to send a clear message. Any challenge to the established order would be crushed without mercy. The court that had sealed Celia's fate was a microcosm of the legal system of the time, where the law was manipulated to protect the interests of the powerful and punish those who dared to challenge their mastery. Judges and lawyers who presided over slave cases were chosen by landowners, men who shared their worldviews and were willing to close their eyes to any injustice as long as their pockets remained full. The decision to condemn Celia was received with approval by the slaveholders, who saw in her a reaffirmation of her absolute power over those who considered her property. For them, the idea of a slave rebels and killing his lord was unthinkable, an affront to the natural order of things that needed to be corrected with maximum severity. At meetings and dinners that followed the trial, men who controlled the fate of so many lives discussed Celia's case with a cold disdain, as if talking about a damaged piece of property, not a human life. They congratulated themselves to have acted with justice, to have protected their interests and demonstrated that any attempt at resistance would be futile. But for slaves, the court's decision was a brutal reminder of the reality in which they lived. They saw how justice was always out of reach, a cruel illusion that only reminded them of their impotence in the face of the crushing power of the whites. However, Celia's death also served as a catalyst, a proof that, even in the face of impossible probabilities, resistance was possible. Between whispers and stealthy glances, slaves began to share stories of resistance, of small acts of disobedience that kept the spirit of Celia alive. For them, she had not died in vain. His death had planted the seed of a revolt that would one day flourish in freedom. The decision to condemn Celia exposed the cracks in the justice system, showing how he was shaped to preserve the supremacy of the ladies and punish anyone who dared to challenge them. But in doing so, it also revealed the fragility of the control they believed to have. For as they celebrated their victory, Celia's spirit of resistance continued to grow, fed by the indignation and determination of the slaves she had left behind. Thus, while slave lords continued to believe their invulnerability, in the darkness of Missouri's nights, slaves dreamed of the day when justice would no longer be just an empty word, but a tangible reality. And while the law remained silent, complicit in oppression, Celia's legacy became stronger, a promise that one day freedom would be conquered. Celia's death had shown to the world the raw and painful truth of a justice system that was not interested in the truth but in maintaining corrupt and inhuman power. And while the powerful continued to rejoice in their apparent victory, in the shadows, a new generation of slaves was lifting, inspired by Celia's sacrifice, determined to fight for a future where her voices would finally hear. Missouri's heat seemed less oppressive that morning, as if time had decided to offer brief relief amid the constant tension that hovered over the region. The soft breeze carried with it the aroma of the magnolias, mixing with the smell of earth and sweat that always permeated the air. But in the midst of apparent tranquility, a silent revolution was being woven in the hearts of those who had witnessed Celia's courage. Celia's story, the young slave who dared to challenge the established order, had spread beyond the limits of George Newsom Plantation. In the fields, in the kitchens, and in the few moments of rest that slaves could steal, his name was whispered with reverence and hope. For many, she had become a symbol of resistance, a tragic heroine who, even in her death, had lit a flame of courage among the oppressed. In distant villages and nearby cities, Celia's legend was beginning to form. Women especially found in their history a source of strength and inspiration. They saw in her not only a victim of the cruelties of slavery, but a warrior who had fought for his own dignity. The stories of their act of resistance were told and retrained, gaining life in the midst of whispers and accomplices, feeding the hope that one day justice would prevail. For slave women, Celia's story was particularly powerful. They lived in a world where violence and abuse were a constant, where their bodies were treated as property without protection or justice. Celia's courage by getting up against her oppressor offered them a glimpse that they were not alone, that the struggle for dignity and freedom was a battle that was worth being fought. In the salons of the powerful, however, Celia's story was told with a different tone. It was used as a dark alert, a lesson that any deviation from the established norm should be crushed quickly. The slaveholders gathered in their mansions, seriously discussing how to prevent other Celias from emerging among their properties. For them, her story was a reminder that absolute control could only be kept through fear and repression. But despite efforts to silence his memory, Celia's legacy continued to grow, fed by those who refused to forget. Slave women, who shared their suffering and struggle, began to form an invisible network of support and resistance. They exchanged coded messages and songs, whispered escape plans at night, and backwardly supported their search for freedom. Celia's story also began to attract the attention of abolitionists and sympathizers of the anti-sclavagist cause. Journalists and writers, who saw in it a clear example of the brutality of the slavery system, began to report their history in newspapers and pamphlets, spreading their narrative through the nation. For them, Celia had become a powerful symbol of the urgent need for change, a living proof that the system was bankrupt and that the struggle for abolition was more necessary than ever. In the following years, Celia's story became a legend, a story told not only in America, but also in distant lands, where the struggle for freedom and justice was a constant battle. His courage inspired poets, musicians, and artists to capture his essence, transforming it into a mythical figure that transcended time and space. For many, Celia's legacy was not just a memory of the past, but a call to action. His story served as a constant reminder that the struggle for justice and equality was a collective responsibility, a mission that required courage, determination, and sacrifice. Each generation that listened to its history was urged to question the status quo, challenge injustices, and fight for a world where everyone could live with dignity and respect. And so, while time continued its relentless course, Celia's story remained alive, a lighthouse of hope in a world of darkness. His life and sacrifice became a testimony of the power of the human spirit, a proof that even in the face of the most overwhelming adversities, courage and determination could light a flame of change that would illuminate the way to future generations. The women who came after her, inspired by their courage, continued to fight for their rights, for freedom and dignity, leading Celia's legacy as a torch of resistance. And while her story continued to echo through the ages, she was not just a remembrance of the past, but a promise that a better future was possible, a promise that one day justice would prevail and freedom would be a reality for everyone.